Thanks for the meeting cards. I don't know.
Hi, Rabbi Tenenbaum. I'm starting it now. Hello?
I don't know.
Yeah. We just finished another year. I see you in the waiting room.
For me, 1 second.
Oh.
Hi, Sarah. I made you a co-host.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Rabbi T. How are you?
A very big ashikach to both Rabbi Johnson and Rabbi Barber for all the wonderful shurim that they're putting on. Both the Tzmid and Kesidron, the regular shurim that they're hosting on a daily basis, and the Musaf and Kilchasam, the special ones for Tishrei, it's for Elul Tishrei, etc. So my father-in-law should be on as well shortly, and I saw Rabbi Groner on also. I assume the reason I was asked to speak was not just because I was in Crown Heights and had the schus Baruch Hashem of being at the Rebbe's Tekiyos that I recall for the last good many years, but also because my grandfather, my father's father, Rav Yosef Menachem Mendel Tenenbaum, known as Mendel Tenenbaum, was the Baal Tekiyah in 770 and blew Shofar by the Rebbe, all the Tekiyos, the sounds that the Rebbe did not blow, which for most years were similar, but for the first few years were a bit different, and we'll get to that. So thank you for the schus and for the opportunity. I'm also the oldest grandson of my grandfather, again, my father's father. So I had an opportunity to spend time with him and also was up on the bima with him when he blew shofar in Musa for Tekiyos the Mu'umad. So first I should just say that Tekiyos by the Rebbe, and I'm going to leave it more for Rabbi Groner being well older than myself, and Baruch Hashem with a great memory. I'm sure we'll be able to give over in much more detail about the Rebbe's Tekiyos. Rabbi Gurevitz in Queensland, you might want to mute yourself. There you go. So I assume that Rabbi Groner will be able to give over in more detail. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Rebbe's Tekiyos. He'll be able to fill that slot in very well. I'm happy to speak about that to some extent. And I understand there's going to be some questions and answers as well. But the most senior of the three of us is Rabbi Groner, again, who had the schus of being by the Rebbe for many, many years during the Lamids and the Mems. So firstly, I should say that Tekiyos was a very, very awesome site. I was zeicha to have a very good place for Tekiyos. There was just an article put out recently about the washing machine. Those that grew up in Crown Heights and those that have been there 770 know exactly what that means. There was a whole group of Bachrim and Yungalite who were right behind the Rebbe's bima, or in front of the Rebbe's bima, to watch the Rebbe's Tekiyos. There were no benches there. There was nothing on the floor in 770, and people moved around and were pushed around like a washing machine. My place for the Rebbe's Tekiyos was, I was the first one, where I stood, at least in that area of 770, the first one above the washing machine. In other words, I had a clear and direct line of sight to the Rebbe. It was a bit farther away because it was the last bench behind all the benches of the Rebbe. When everyone turned around for Tekiyos, it turned around to be the first bench. The pushing was incredible and enormous. My uncle, Yankel Spritzer, had his family's places there. The pushing was so terrible that my uncle had myself, together with Zalman Karp, Rabbi Glick's son-in-law, and a few other big guys, that used to hold everyone back from flying into that place. In the later years, it got so terrible that we actually had to build wooden boards between the benches so that no one can get in. And it was a sight to see. You saw people that were pushing for hours and might have expended their energy a bit too soon. And by the time the Rebbe's Tekiyos started, they were expelled. I don't want to say but they were expelled from the washing machine and never made it to the actual Tekiyos to be there up close. But in any case, like I mentioned, I did have a direct line of sight to the Rebbe, and the sight of seeing the Rebbe in his talis with the panim, blowing shofar, saying the brachas and the psukim was an incredible sight, one that stands in my head every year. When I blow shofar, when shuls are open, I actually have the schus to blow shofar here in 770 in Kimberley. And when Rabbi L asked me about 7, 8 years ago to blow shofar there, I said I can't refuse because my last name is Tenenbaum and it is 770. And my grandfather was known for blowing shofar there all the years of the Rebbe's Nesias. Before that, I used to blow shofar in the shul that I was a rabbi in an East Melbourne shul. So I had this chus and have this chus of blowing shofar for many, many years. I want to talk a little bit about the history, about how it evolved that my grandfather blew shofar alongside the Rebbe. So Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud, when the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, the Frierdiker Rebbe used to blow shofar. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe blew shofar alongside someone called an Elter Chassid called Rebbe Rifkin. After the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away in 1950, the first year of the Rebbe's leadership, in Rosh Hashanah of Tafshin Yud Aleph, Rabbi Rifkin blew the first 30, and my grandfather blew the other 100. In other words, the 30 in the Shtila Shemini Esrei, the 30 in Chazar Sashatz, the 10 after Kaddish, and then the 30 as Minut Chabadis to blow after Tehillim. So the first year, the Rebbe did not partake in blowing shofar at all. The tefillos were upstairs in the Frierdiker Rebbe's room, as it was for the duration of the Avelos of the Frierdiker Rebbe. In Tafshin Yud Beis in 1952, the Rebbe called my grandfather in, and the Rebbe told him two things. The Rebbe told him, firstly, he told him how to go to the mikveh before Tekiyos. About Tekiyos meant to go to the mikveh. There's a special way of going to the mikveh. It's called dog pashut dog. And that means that you go in like a fish, the normal way of going in, then you go straight, sort of straight, lying out straight, horizontally. And then again, like a dog, like a fish, and you do that 3 times, 3 times 3. The other thing, that's a special way of doing it for Tekiyos. The Rebbe also told my grandfather about learning the Maimer that we all know, that another shir was on recently, the Maimer of the Frierdiker Rebbe in the Siddur Tfilos and Dach of Lahavin in Tekiyos Shofar. So there was a specific Maimer that had to be learned in order to prepare yourself for blowing the shofar. That year, the way my grandfather describes it, the Rebbe got up on the bima. The Rebbe used to say maftir. So after maftir, then comes shofar. So the Rebbe started off by saying lam natseach. When you start off the lam natseach, to say 7 times. And then the Rebbe said the psukim, the various psukim, which are the kras satan. What happened then is that the Rebbe turned to my grandfather to make the brachas. My grandfather says that he sort of froze. He refused to a certain extent. He did not want to make the brachas. The Rebbe asked him again, and he didn't respond. And he always repeated, and he said that the reason why he didn't respond, the reason why he had the, I don't want to say the chutzpah, or the ability not to answer the Rebbe, was in his mind, he had seen the Frierdiker Rebbe blow shofar. And that means that a Rebbe is supposed to blow the shofar. The Nasi is supposed to blow the shofar. And he didn't think any differently. He didn't think it was possible that the Rebbe would not blow shofar. So when the Rebbe asked him, he just sort of didn't understand. He couldn't understand how the Rebbe himself would not want to blow shofar. So he froze. He didn't say anything. He has said that if the Rebbe would have asked him a 3rd time, which is in Shulchan Aruch that you can't refuse 3 times, then he would have done it. But the Rebbe did not, thankfully. Once he didn't respond to the Rebbe's request, the Rebbe then made the brachas, and he gave the shofar to my grandfather to blow. So in 1952, the Rebbe again did the Lamnatzech, the Psukim, and the brachas, but all of the sounds of the shofar, including the first 30, my grandfather blew them, and then the other sounds throughout the duration of Musaf. In Tafshin Yud Gimel, the next year in 1953, the Rebbe did not even ask my grandfather to make the brachas. The Rebbe went straight again from Lamnatzech and the Psukim into the brachas, and then the Rebbe blew 1 Tekiyah, just 1 Tekiyah, the first Tekiyah, and he handed the shofar to my grandfather, and my grandfather blew the rest, the other 99, plus the other 30 after Musaf. In Tafshin Yud Dalet in 1954, that's when the standard minhag became, and this continued all the years, that the Rebbe not just again did Lamnatzech and the Psukim and the brachas, but the Rebbe blew the full Tekiyos, the Miyushav, the full first 30 Tekiyos, and also the Psukim after, and then my grandfather blew the rest. So that only started, that minhag, which most of us are familiar with, only started in 1954. This continued all the way through till 1992, and I'll get to 1992 a bit later on. I don't know how many people know, I don't know how many people here would have been there at that time, but in Tafshin Chaf, in 1960, the Rebbe attempted to blow shofar, and pretty much the first sound, the Rebbe did not continue. The Rebbe was finding it very, very difficult. There were times that there were difficulties. There's a famous story of the Tekiyos kinder in the early Lameds, which Rabbi Groner can describe if he wishes. And other times that the Rebbe had to go back, and sometimes it took longer, sometimes it took shorter. But in Tafshin Chaf, and I again confirmed this with my father, as was earlier today or tonight in New York, and I've heard it from others as well, the Rebbe could not get any sound out. Das Tachtain, which means in our estimation, which doesn't mean much, they say that the Rebbe had some dental work done before Yom Tov, not long before Yom Tov, and as a result of that, the Rebbe was finding it very difficult. But other than that year, from 1954 all the way through 1992, the Rebbe again used to blow the first 30 sounds, and my grandfather used to blow the rest. Now, before the Rebbe started blowing shofar, he used to turn, I think, to both sides. The Rebbe definitely turned around to check who was behind him, and the Rebbe wanted to confirm that certain people were behind him. One of those people was my grandfather. The Rebbe would not blow shofar until he was sure my grandfather was there. Reb Shmuel Levitin was there. Some people say that he was the Makri until he passed away at the end of Lamed Dalid. He was the person that appointed in the Rebbe's Machzor. Some people say not. There's a bit of a discrepancy there. I'm not 100% sure. There were other times that the Rebbe invited certain people onto the bima to stand beside him, like Rabbi L Futafast. He came out of Russia. Also, very often, the Zacha Begirl, the person who won the raffle from Eretz Yisrael or from other places, was also invited up to the Rebbe's bima. When the Rebbe finished the 30 Tekiyos and the 3 Psukim, before he went down the bima to go back to his place in the front of 770, the Rebbe used to point to the 3 shofaros that he used and asked my grandfather to choose one of them. So the Rebbe gave my grandfather the ability to choose one of the 3 shofaros that he had. My grandfather always chose the shofar that the Rebbe used that year. It wasn't always the same, apparently. And my grandfather made sure to take the opportunity of the special schus. So he always chose the shofar that the Rebbe used for that specific year. And then he used to give it back to the Rebbe after the Rebbe, after my grandfather finished his Tekiyos. Between Tafshin Lamed Hey to Tafshin Lamed Zayin, 75 to 77, there was no Makri. The first day, Rosh Hashanah Tafshin Lamed Ches, many people can confirm this, they saw this, Rabbi L Groner, Olav Hashalom, was running through 770 looking for my grandfather before davening started. When he found my grandfather, he told my grandfather that the Rebbe wanted my grandfather to be the Makri from then on. Now, Minich Chabad, I can see that perhaps not everyone on here is 100% Minich Chabad. So Minich Chabad, as you might know, is not to say out like Tkiya or Shvarim Trua, but to point in the Siddur to that sound that's being said. So from 1978 until 1992, my grandfather used to stand right by the Rebbe and point in the Siddur to the words in the Machzor, which were that exact sound that the Rebbe was sounding at that time. I did see this written down, and I'm not sure if it's true or not, that in those middle years between 74 and 77, the Rebbe himself at times pointed with his left hand or the left finger in the Machzor, on the place that he was up to, while blowing shofar with his right hand. I don't know if that's true or not, but I did see that being brought down in one of the Svarim, perhaps. I think it was in the Sefer called Eitzer Minhagei Chabad. My grandfather did speak about a few things. One thing he spoke about was that he always remembered, even though it was hard for him to give over, the nigun that the Rebbe sang. The Rebbe sang to himself a certain Chassidic nigun before he blew shofar. And my grandfather always said that was an unbelievable sight to hear, of the special nigun that the Rebbe sang to himself. He was humming this to himself before he blew the shofar. It was actually a very emotional nigun, and at times the Rebbe cried, and sometimes the Rebbe cried actually quite strongly. The Rebbe mentioned at a certain point at one time that when it came to I think it was the Frierdiker Rebbe who said that when it says to prepare yourself a shofar, which is brought down in the Machzer, l'Tkiya shofar, that actually means the Rebbe said that means to sing or to learn about the nigun that the Rabbeim before him sang. In other words, I think it's the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe used to sing this nigun. So the Rebbe mentioned this in the last year that the Rebbe had the Sudas upstairs in the Frierdiker Rebbe's home. So in Tafshan Lamed Aleph and Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe said this to someone. They used to ask the Rebbe questions there, and the Rebbe said this to someone, that when it says Yachin Atzma L'Tkiya Shofar, that actually refers to the nigun, to the song that both the Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab used to sing before Tkiya Shofar. The Rebbe used to bring the shofars with him when he went to Maftir. He used to bring with him 2 sidurim and sometimes 3 sidurim. Also the handkerchiefs, 1 red and a few white ones, 3 white ones, and also many, many bags of panim. In the later years, I remember clearly that there was quite a few years, there were 4 big brown paper bags full of panim that people sent out or sent to the Rebbe before Rosh Hashanah. In Tafshin Mem Gimel, in 1983, the Rebbe mentioned in a Sikha that some people, I don't remember the exact lashon, but some people or the Rebbe used to say Yiskar quietly also on the 2nd day of Rosh Hashanah, and the Rebbe said every person should decide on their own if that's something they want to take up. The Rebbe said that, I think the Sikha was on Vav Tishrei Tafshin Mem Gimel. If you want to look it up in detail, you're welcome to do that. Also, in between the stanzas of the sets of Tashrat, Tashat, and Tarat, where it says Yisvada Balachash, so Chassidim always knew that Yisvada Balachash means Tzir Pnei Arav, to picture the face of the Rebbe in between those stanzas. And again, Baruch Hashem, having seen the case of the Rebbe for many years, I'm still able to picture that in my mind. That is a wonderful schus. Now, the Tekiyos Mu'umad for the 70 Tekiyos and then the 100 Tekiyos after, which again my grandfather blew every single year, actually starting from 1951. Even the first few years that the Rebbe didn't blow all of them, my grandfather blew more than 70 or more than the 70 plus 30. I used to stand in the 80s, I used to stand next to my grandfather, and how did we know when to blow shofar? So we knew when to blow shofar. I was standing next to him. I said it was very simple. Rabbi Groner, who stood next to the Rebbe all the way up front in the Mizrach on the right corner of 770, again, it was flat between the bima and the Rebbe's place. The Rebbe's place was on a higher platform. So when Rabbi Groner turned around, we on the bima could clearly see that was a similar. Rabbi Groner was checking where the Rebbe was up to in Shemon Esrei, and when the Rebbe got up to, he finished the end of Malchias, was Zechrenes or Shofar, so whatever it was, Rabbi Groner then used to signal to us, and then we knew that it was time to blow shofar for everyone in 770. Now, when it comes to the hefsek between the Shvar and Trua, I'm talking about in Tashrat. I'm sure Rabbi Groner is going to address it in more detail, but I'll just bring down a few things that I saw. The Rebbe said in the Sudan, Tafshin Chavtes in 1969, the Rebbe said that his father, that the Frierdiker Rebbe said, the Rebbe quoted in the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe, when it came to stories, was very medactic and only relied on stories that he heard from the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the Rebbe said that the Frierdiker Rebbe said that his father used to make a hefsek, not a breath. You're not supposed to take a breath. Again, I'm talking about the first 30 tkiyos. But he used to make a hefsek between. He wasn't sure if the hefsek was because of the Rebbe Rashab's health or is because of another inyan, a spiritual inyan. And he didn't ask. But he did know, he did realize that the Rebbe Rashab made a hefsek. Rabbi Rifkin, Rabbi Beryl Rifkin, the one who used to blow shofar for the Frierdiker Rebbe, he is quoted as saying that when the Frierdiker Rebbe was pointing, if the Frierdiker Rebbe was the Makri, was pointing to the Shvarim Trua, the Frierdiker Rebbe did not move his finger from the Shvarim to the Trua, or from the Shvarim to the Trua until he realized that Rabbi Rifkin made at least some sort of hefsek. Now it's very hard. All of us who have ever been there, by the Rebbe Shofar over the years. If the Rebbe made a hefsek, it wasn't really discernible. It was really hard to tell. To your regular ears, it sounded like the Rebbe went pretty much close from a shvarim straight into a trua. Now, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch has brought down, because of the machlekes, that you do have to make a hefsek. You don't take a breath, but you have to make a hefsek of some sort. And you have to be very careful not to make too long of a hefsek, and that the hefsek should certainly not turn into a neshima, certainly shouldn't turn into a breath, because that can create problems halachically for the sounds of the shofar. Again, I'm sure Rabbi Groner is going to address it, but for people who heard the Rebbe shofar, if the Rebbe did make a hefsek, and likely the Rebbe did, it was one that was a very minor hefsek and one that you couldn't really tell and couldn't really hear that much. And I've spoken again about this to quite a few people. Now, Rosh Hashanah Tafshin and Beis, Rosh Hashanah 1992, in the Sikha of the Rebbe, and you can look it up in Teres Menachem on page 27, Neis Dalid, the Rebbe said something that I believe he had never said before. I haven't learned every single Sikha in depth of Rosh Hashanah, but I've never heard it quoted somewhere else, and I've spoken to other people who do know the Rebbe's Sikhas, and we don't believe that the Rebbe ever said anything similar to this. This is the year of the Rebbe's stroke, unfortunately, that the Rebbe had in Chav Zayin Adar. So that year, Rosh Hashanah and Tafshin and Beis in 1992, the Rebbe said the halacha, this is what the Rebbe mentioned often, the halacha Shulchan Aruch, that Yadimu Pnei HaTekeah, the person who blows shofar, his face turns red. And the Rebbe says this is because the Ikar Hadam, the main blood flow, flows to the face when a person is blowing shofar. What the Rebbe did, and the Rebbe said because of the Yigia and the Oimetz, because of the Haravanya and the strength that one needs to be able to get the sounds out. What the Rebbe had never said before, but I did say that year, was to do it in a way that it's not Pagea Chas V'Shalom and B'rias Haguf. The Rebbe said, in other words, that about the Tekiyos has to be careful that when he blows shofar and all the blood rushes to his face, that he's not exerting too much energy or too much force in a way that's detrimental to a person's health. Okay, and that's something that the Rebbe had never said before. That year, on Chav Zayin Adar, the Rebbe had a stroke. I'm not a doctor, but medically, I believe there are two ways that one can get a stroke. And one way is if too much blood rushes to the brain. And then there is the blood bursts. So that year that the Rebbe spoke, and the Rebbe said again to be careful that Chas v'Shalom doesn't affect the person's health, the Rebbe had a stroke that year on Chav Zayin Adar. And from then on, the Rebbe couldn't blow shofar. 6 months to the day, exactly 6 months to the day in that same year, on Chav Zayin Elul, 6 months later, my grandfather had a stroke as well. Exactly 6 months to the day in that same year. In other words, both the Rebbe and my grandfather blew shofar in 770, as I mentioned, over all those years. And both of them had a stroke that year that the Rebbe spoke about not having an ill adverse health effect. And again, it was exactly 6 months to the day. My grandfather was in a coma for many, many months in Maimonides Hospital in Borough Park. And my grandfather passed away, Gimel Teves Tafshin Nun Dalid. If you count 6 months exactly from Gimel Teves, you get to Gimel Tammuz, Tafshin Nun Dalid. The Rebbe was installed. What that means, I don't know, but I know that the facts are, as I mentioned, that my grandfather had a stroke exactly 6 months to the day that the Rebbe had a stroke in that same year of 1992. And the Rebbe didn't blow shofar anymore, and my grandfather didn't blow shofar either. My uncle, different uncles, two different uncles that took over and blew in 770 over the years. Rabbi David Raskin also blew in 770 at times. And then 2 years later, or 18 months later, my grandfather had a stroke, as I mentioned, on Gimel Teves in 1994. He was in a coma all the way through. And then the Rebbe, again, 6 months later, was Gimel Tammuz of 1994. Now, another interesting thing that happened also last year of the Rebbe's, the last year of when the Rebbe blew shofar, Begolui, is that you generally Yom Kippur, when you have the sound of the shofar after Ne'ilah, the Rebbe used to actually, there was Napoleon's March, the famous Napoleon's March, which is also an awesome sight to see and to be part of. And after Napoleon's March finished, the Rebbe went back, or either walked down the steps in the later years or went off his chair. Again, in different years, there was a different setup, and then turned to the wall where the Rebbe used to daven all the time. That year, instead of turning to the wall, the Rebbe actually remained turning remained turned west, facing the Kol, facing the congregation and everyone in 770. And the Rebbe looked at my grandfather for the entire time that he blew Shofar, all the way through until the end of Shofar, and only after the Shofar did the Rebbe turn back around to face the eastern wall, the Mizrach land, which again, all the years before then, the Rebbe did not do that, and that the Rebbe did on the last year. Being the oldest grandchild, I have the schus of having one of my grandfather's Shofars. I don't know if it was ever used in 770 by the Rebbe. There is a chance, a slight chance. I do know, and I've spoken to my father and my uncles, who have all told me that my grandfather used to try to use the Rebbe Shofar as much as possible. I mentioned earlier in the beginning that the Rebbe used to allow my grandfather to choose one Shofar, one of the Rebbe Shofars, and he always chose the one that the Rebbe used that year, and he tried to blow all the kolos from that Shofar. Not always, I think, did he manage to use that for the full 100 that he blew. So there were times that I used one of the shofars, but being the oldest grandchild, I did manage to get one shofar of my grandfather. It's a chance that it was used in 770. Perhaps not, but I feel obviously for myself that's a great schus. And Emet Hashem, let's be zecher to hear shofar from the Rebbe again, to see that awesome sight. And we should all be zecher to be together in Eretz Yisrael in the Beis Mikdash Shlishi, not have to worry about lockdown and worry about what kind of minyan or what kind of shul we're having, but to hear shofar from Mashiach Tzidkenu, B'mheira v'yameinu mamash. Thank you, Rabbi Barber, again for the opportunity.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rabbi Tenenbaum, for sharing those inspiring words with us and a little bit of the family experience and personal experience. We certainly appreciate it. We look forward to having Rabbi Groner expound on this subject shortly. In the meantime, though, I think Dr. Motel Greenbaum is with us. Dr. Greenbaum, are you with us now? One moment. Okay. While we wait for Dr. Greenbaum perhaps to be with us on video, maybe we'll send it over to Rabbi Chaim Tzvi Groner. We'll pick up where Rabbi Tenenbaum left off. Rabbi Groner as well spent many years in 770 and has many relations that would have had a great insight into the Tekiyos by the Rebbe. In addition to being a veteran Baal Tekiyah himself, Rabbi Groner can share both insights on the Rebbe's Tekiyos and practical advice on how to blow Tekiyos for each one of us. Rabbi Groner.
Good evening. I think as soon as the Motel Greenbaum gets on, he should begin, correct? But okay, I will in the meantime make a start. I Baruch Hashem was zeicher to be by the Rebbe for Rosh Hashanah of a period of 9 years. I did not count which years were Shabbos, like this year, the first day, but from Tovshin Lamed Daled, which is Rosh Hashanah 1973, up until Tovshin Mem Aleph. That's 1980. I was able to be by the Rebbe for Rosh Hashanah and to see the Rebbe blow shofar. The first 2 years, I believe it was, so the only place that I managed to get to be able to see the Rebbe's Tekiyos shofar was on the ground, in the washing machine, as was mentioned by Rabbi Tenenbaum before. Yes, there was an article just recently disseminated on social media about the washing machine. That's what it was called. When you were standing on the ground of 770, especially at the time when the Rebbe was blowing shofar and the lead up to it, so the place was so packed and so squashed and moving around all the time, and with all the heat and all of the perspiration, etc. So you were like in a washing machine. A couple of years later, I was zeicher to have a better place. There was a bench on the side of 770, which would be on the right-hand side. That means it was up against the platform where the Rebbe's Farbrengen table was. and that was actually organized by a group of Australians. And standing on the bench off the floor, you were saved from the swishing around, but the squeeze, the tight squeeze, was maybe in a way worse because you're not against the wall, but against other benches on that platform, etc. But anyway, but from there higher up, and it was a very, very good view. The downside of that was that it was on the side, as on the side of the Rebbe. So we were standing to the Rebbe's right-hand side when the Rebbe was standing on the bimah, facing the Aron Kodesh, as the Baltikea does. So we were standing on the Rebbe's right-hand side. So let me just go through the situation in order to be able to secure a place. So as much as there is this washing machine situation, nevertheless there was somewhat of a seder, an order of certain places being to a degree kavua, fixed places that people sort of like had a claim to. And there were certain rules about that if you want to, so it was known from year to year, etc. The year that I came, that was the year when 770 was expanded and went all the way to Kingston Avenue. And the area in 770 was far larger than it had ever been before, so that made that easier also. But there were Mekomis Kvuyim, and the rule was that you had to be there early in the morning in order to claim. You had to be there like 7 in the morning. Davening started at 10 o'clock. But let's just go now to actual details. So Ashrei, as it says in the Marzer, which we say in Kippur by the Aveda, that Ashrei Ayin Rasa Kol Eile. Fortunate is the eye that saw when the Kohen Gadol did the Aveda in the Beis Hamikdash, and so too we say the same. But those who had the schus to see this tremendous, awesome scene of the Rebbe blowing shofar. So, as was mentioned before by Rabbi Tenenbaum, the Rebbe, when you'd come up to the bimah, the Rebbe had maftir every Shabbos and Yom Tov. The only exception was Yom Kippur to Shachris. The Rebbe did not have maftir; he just had maftir yoina. The Rebbe had, therefore, both days of Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe had maftir, so the Rebbe would already come up to the bimah when he was called up for maftir. Actually, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe would say Kaddish for his sister-in-law, the youngest daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rebbe Shena, Hashem Yinkim Doma, who were perished in Treblinka on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe would say Kaddish for, so the Rebbe would come up already to the bimah when Kaddish was being recited at the end of Kriyas HaTorah. The Rebbe would take with him his shofars and 2 or 3 sidurim, as was already mentioned, and also the Rebbe's mazkirim, or 2 of them, my uncle Allah Shalom, Rabbi Groner, and Rabbi Groner, and Rabbi Binyamin Klein, Zichrenim Levracha, would carry the packages of pidyones, of panim, Pidyon Nefesh. Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe would stand for hours, and the days leading up to Erev Rosh Hashanah too, personally accepting from each chassid a letter of request for a Shana Tova, and they came from all over the world. And the Rebbe packed them, not even all of them, but the Rebbe packed a certain amount of them in brown paper bags. It was like, don't have them over here, like shopping bags, etc., whatever. And then they were tied up with some string, etc. And they were quite large. And they were actually, during the davening, they were there up near the Rebbe on a table. There was a table there for those special letters of request of bracha. And they came up with the Rebbe. And at the time of the maftir and the haftarah, so they were on the bimah, sort of like just placed there randomly by the maskirim, the Rebbe secretaries. That understandably also obstructed the view that those who were on the ground, so there was now an obstacle. You needed to be a bit taller to be able to see past it. That was a different issue. The Rebbe would have the Aliyah to Mafta, then read the Haftarah with tremendous emotion, especially on the Thursday. It's a very, very moving Haftarah, the story of Hannah, who was begging and crying and pleading with Hashem for a child, and it was very, very moving. At the end of when the Haftarah was over, so then the preparation for Tekiyos began. Now, there were certain people, also Rabbi Tenenbaum mentioned, and I don't know all the details at all, far from it, that Rebbe wanted that they should be on the bima with him. I know he wanted certain chassidim who went through the tough times in Russia, who had been in Siberia, etc. One of them was Reb Mendel Futterfass, who many of us here know. He was the brother-in-law of Reb Zalman Serebransky, Zechron Levracha. He used to get an aliyah on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and he used to be on the Rebbe's bima, but I don't know all the details. Anyway, the hachonis, the preparations for Tekiyos began after the Haftarah. The first thing that the Rebbe would do himself was then look at those packages which had been placed on the bima. Mamish on the bima, that means where the Sefer Torah was, that's where they were placed. And then the Rebbe used to then organize them in the fashion that he wanted them to be, right? Placing them, and there were quite a few. And I think later on, they were a few less and maybe smaller ones. And the Rebbe would organize it. So those who were standing on the floor, wherever they were standing, if the Rebbe chose that the pekel, as it was called, of panim was in a particular way which obstructed them, so then that already reshaped the whole shuffle on the floor. But anyway, after that, so then the first thing we know that before we say the Tekiyos, so the Perek Mem Zayin of the 47th chapter of Tehillim is said, Lam Natzeach Livnei Kerech Mizmer, is said by the whole congregation 7 times. Now, what the Rebbe used to do is he used to take the talis. If you want, I can give you even the way the Rebbe held the talis was unique. I mean, the whole year, it was a very, very interesting sight. The Rebbe held it. The Rebbe held it in a very interesting way. Just give me a second over here. I can actually show how it was done. So the Rebbe had the talis on his shoulders, but then the Rebbe would lift the talis like this. And if you can see it well, holding the talis like this of his head, the 2 sides, and the Rebbe would begin the first pasuk of the kapitel. Lam natseyach livnei koirach mizmoir. And then, of course, everybody would respond, and then everybody said, what the Rebbe then did, took the talis, and he threw it over his head and over all the packages of the pidyonis. Mamish threw it. I remember one year, the Rebbe gave such a strong throw that the talis flew over his head, totally the bottom of the talis, and the Rebbe quickly picked it up and put it back on his head also. So, while everybody was saying the 7 recitations of that chapter of Tehillim, the Rebbe was covered completely with the talis, and the Rebbe, which covered also those packages of pidyonis, and the Rebbe was, now I remember the very first time that I was down on the floor, but I was actually able to see, and the Rebbe was of course saying the chapter of Tehillim. It is known that the Rebbe sang a nigun, but you had to be very, very close to hear the Rebbe sing a nigun. And there were times when the Rebbe would cry uncontrollably. The first year I noticed how the Rebbe was under the talis. The Rebbe was, you could see how the talis was lying on the Rebbe's hand, and the Rebbe's head was in his hands, and the Rebbe was shaking. The Rebbe was shaking. You could see how the Rebbe was shaking from the crying. When that was over, so then the Rebbe would stand upright, and you could see how the Rebbe's face was very red and teary from that. And then the Rebbe would hold. Then the Rebbe would hold again the talus like this. I hope I'm holding it correctly, right? The talus with, like this, over his head and open the talus like that. And then the Rebbe would start saying the psukim in a special tune. They say that this is the tune, I believe, of his father. You go through all those psukim in Hameitzar Korosiko, and then of course everybody, the whole congregation, responding with a very, very moving response. I'm going through all the psukim, etc. And most of the years, the method, the way the Rebbe said them were standard, sometimes with different emphasis on different words, and that's already a different story. After that, so then after if you see in the Machzer, I have a Machzer open. After that, there is a Yehi Rotzen, and this Yehi Rotzen, although in some editions of the Machzer, I'm holding here actually a Machzer, it's a Chabad Machzer, and it says here, all continue, but the custom is that only the Baltikei says it. So the Rebbe once again covered his face, and he said that Yehi Rotzen, and then the shofars were in front of him, and he made sure that they're there, of course. I'm now just being careful how to choose my words, because there was a major difference between the first day and the second day. Right? The first day they were arranged them, but not with not any special, the way it looked to us, nothing so special, not so elaborate as on the second day. The Rebbe would then make the brachas. What then the Rebbe did was very interesting. So then, while the Rebbe was saying the psukim, so I showed you how the Rebbe had the talus, and the Rebbe made the brachas, all right, before the Tekiyos, the Rebbe had the talus behind his ears. Right? Mamash had the talus over his head, talus behind his ears. That's how the Rebbe had it, the talus behind his ears. Rabbi Tenenbaum, you remember this? Rabbi Tenenbaum, I'm looking at, you can dot his head. You remember, I'm not making this up, right? The Rebbe had the talus behind his ears.
I'm not sure every
And
time,
then
but
would
quite
make
a
the
few
brachas
times.
on the shofar. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu. Very, very often, right? And there are times when it fall down and you fix it again and put it. Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvos v'tzivonu lishma kol shofar. And then the bracha of Shechiyanu was also the same introduction. Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu lizman hazeh. Anyway, see the time is running out. Still Dr. Greenland has to speak. Now, I just want to mention that on the second
It appears that we've lost Rabbi Groner. So in the meantime, while we wait for him to reconnect, which we hope will be speedily, Rabbi Tenenbaum has agreed to field a few questions. He told me before he spoke this evening, they'd be happy to answer any questions. Sorry, Rabbi Tenenbaum, you're the remaining speaker with us. If anybody has any questions about Tekiyos by the Rebbe or the general atmosphere, I guess, Rabbi Tenenbaum might be happy to take your questions. If we have any questions. I'm just working to get Rabbi Groner back on.
While you're getting Rabbi Groner back on, just mentioning that unfortunately Dr. Greenbaum will not be able to make it tonight. So we're waiting for Rabbi Groner to get back on. Apologies on behalf of Dr. Greenbaum. He's not going to be able to make it tonight. I don't know where Rabbi Groner ran. Rabbi Groner is the one to answer the questions. We have Rabbi Lipsker who can also answer questions and many others, but go ahead, fire away.
Right. If no one has a question, I have a question, if that's okay. Is there anything you can tell us interesting about the actual kolos, the sounds that the Rebbe would blow? So the Tekiyos, were they very long? Were they short? The Trua, were they long or short? And also the Shvarim. How did the Rebbe blow the Shvarim? By both Shvarim and Shvarim Trua.
Okay, Rabbi Johnson, thank you. I would say, again, that the Rebbe's Tekiyos, the sounds are very deliberate. The Truas were definitely slow. Rabbi Groner is back here, so I'll just finish answering this briefly. The Truas were definitely slow and sort of not flowing into each other.
I'm sorry, I lost my.
Go ahead.
We'll have to give a demonstration of how the Rebbe's Trua went. No.
Go ahead. But I just mentioned that unfortunately, that my father-in-law will not be able to make it. Yes, yeah. I'm just saying you don't have to worry about time, Rabbi Groner. My father-in-law won't be able to get on, so the time is all yours.
I heard that.
I don't know if it's just me, Rabbi Groner, but your connection is a bit grainy.
Yeah, I heard. Okay, but it is already 9:20. Before we get to the actual Tekiyos, I heard about Johnson's question, and I wanted to get to that. But just the second day, the Rebbe made elaborate arrangement of the shofars with the scarf and the handkerchiefs that he had. So the Rebbe had a white scarf, which was a scarf which was from previous years. The Rebbe also had a new white scarf the second day of Rosh Hashanah, where it says that when you blow 2 days, when it's not Shabbos, so the Baal Tekeah should have a new garment for the Shechiyonu, like we have a new fruit the second night. And so the Rebbe had a brand new white scarf. And the Rebbe put that scarf on at the end of the whole Tekiyos. But the point is that the Rebbe arranged, so there was an old one, and that was laid out on the table. And then on top of that, I think another smaller handkerchief. On top of that, the Rebbe arranged 3 shofars. What I saw was 3 shofars. And you could Google search, you'll find it's in the library of the Rebbe's shofar collection. And it's been showed on social media. And then covered it with the red. This is from my memory, covered it with the red handkerchief, and then covered it over with the end of the scarf. On the second day, the white new scarf was on top. When the Rebbe made the brachas, he didn't touch the shofars. When the Rebbe made the brachas shechiyan on the second day, the Rebbe was holding on to the white, the brand new white silk scarf, which was the beged, the chodosh. That's when the Rebbe picked up the shofar. And so I'll tell you my very first impression, the first kid I heard from the Rebbe. So when I was taken aback was that the Rebbe blew on a very low tone. I grew up hearing about the Tekiyah blowing on a loud tone. The Rebbe's tone of blowing was a low tone. Mamish a low tone. That's how the Rebbe blew. The Rebbe's face got red. Rabbi Tenenbaum mentioned before. It's actually from the Arizal. In Pri Etz Chaim, it says that the face of the Baal Tekiyah should get red. But the Rebbe blew on a low tone. The Rebbe's shvarim is very, very difficult to copy. I listened to it many, many times, and to be able to copy it identical, I find it very difficult. And I think what I've heard other people trying to copy it, I think it's extremely difficult. from what I heard and what I've asked others also, and I also spoke to somebody just recently who was many times with the Rebbe's Tekiyos. The Rebbe did not make any hefsek. The Shvarim and the True of Tashrat flowed one into the other. Although it says the Shulchan, but that's how the Rebbe blew the Tekiyos. And the Rebbe's True was slow. It wasn't far from it. Far from it, the Rebbe's True was. That's how the Rebbe's True was. The Rebbe's Tekiyos, as it says in Shulchan Aruch, the Tekiyah of Tashrat was longer than the Tekiyah, True Tekiyah, as is mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. The Rebbe did definitely 9 Truas. Now, the years that I was there, Baruch Hashem, all through those years, the Tekiyos went quite smoothly. It was the year before my first Rosh Hashanah, which was the year in Tafshin Lamed Gimel, Rosh Hashanah 1972. That's when it took about, this is what I was told, it was about 45 minutes for the Rebbe to get to the last Tekiyah. Just one Tekiyah, 45 minutes, and it was, they say it was Oyim V'Noira. It was quite frightening. Now, the Rebbe placed, there's an interesting, the Rebbe placed the Shofar. The Rebbe placed the Shofar in his mouth like this. There are many Baltei Tekiyah who they cover their mouth like this while they're blowing because they don't want the air. It's difficult. They want to make sure that the air is not coming out from the other part of the lips and it's going only into the Shofar. The Rebbe did not hold his hand there. But there were times, what I remember, that sometimes the Rebbe would put his finger to his lip for a second and then remove it. There were times that the Rebbe did that, to my memory. Now, in regards to Makri, as is our minig, as mentioned before, pointing. So when I was there, I came in Tafshin Lamed Daled. There was nobody pointing for the Rebbe. What happened the years before, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I hadn't heard that there was anybody. I know recently people were saying that Shmuel Witten did, and I've asked somebody else, and they said they don't recall such a thing. Rabbi Lipska, I'd like you to ask your father what he remembers, because your father remembers from way, way back. I think Rabbi Tenenbaum, I told you to ask your father the same question. But what I did notice, I remembered that it was in Tafshin Lamed Ches when all of a sudden, especially I was standing up on that bench, I noticed that now Rabbi Tenenbaum, Allah Shalom, is pointing for the Rebbe. I also do want to make mention, because I was standing on that side, on the Rebbe's right-hand side, and because the Rebbe was holding the shofar to his right-hand side, sometimes the talus would fall down while the Rebbe was blowing, and so it would cover the right-hand side of his face. So those of us who were standing on that side, so we couldn't actually see the Rebbe's face at that time, but we still saw the shofar. In between the Seder of Tashrat and Tashat and Tarat, the Rebbe would stop, put down the shofar, and cover himself, but it was very, very short. Where it says there, V'yisvade belachash, it was a very short pause, but with the shofar down and the Rebbe covering himself. After the Tekiyos, so then everybody says the Yehirotzen. There is a Yehirotzen afterwards. Okay, everybody said that, and when everybody had finished, so then the Rebbe would say the 3 psukim afterwards. Asherei Hawam Yodei Seruah Hashem B'yoir Panecha Yehaleichum. The next pasuk the Rebbe would say on a higher, louder tone. Yishimcha Yigilon Kol Hayayim Uvetzit Koscha Yaromo. And the third pasuk, even in a higher tone, louder. Kisiferes Uzamai Ata And then Ashrei was said. And then, before the Rebbe left the Bima, that was the time already for the Sifrei Torah to go down. The Chazan did not come up to the Bima in 770. The Chazan used to start later on it's every Shabbos like that in 770. So when the Rebbe was finished Ashrei, before he was going down, the Rebbe would turn around, look for Rabbi Tenenbaum. They should come and take the shofars, whether it's right or left. I remember that Rabbi Tenenbaum always chose the shofar that the Rebbe had actually blown with. That's my memory, Rabbi Tenenbaum. That Yezeda always picked the shofar which the Rebbe had just blown. I don't recall if you mentioned the fact that a few days before Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe sent out the shofars to Yezeda, correct? That he should practice with them, with those very shofars that the Rebbe was going to bring to Tekiyos. So the Rebbe had them sent out to Rabbi Tenenbaum, who would be doing the rest of the Tekiyos, that he should practice with them before Rosh Hashanah. Before any questions, what else have I think that I have? I think I have covered so far what I have, the notes that I have written to share, right? And the
Rebbe turning around
like
after.
ask a question. Oh, yeah. I've got that here, Taka too. Yes. All right. So when the Rebbe would, the Sifrei Torah would go down, and the Rebbe would follow the Sifrei Torah, and the Rebbe would wait until the Sifrei Torah were put back into the Aron Kodesh. And by the way, that didn't take a quick moment because of such an enormous crowd squeezed into such a place. So as they called it, Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, when they saw the Rebbe's coming. So then, it opened up. Anyway, so when the Rebbe finally went back to his place, and actually from that year, it was Tafshin Lamed Daled, 1973, that's the first time they had this bima, this platform for the Rebbe to daven on for the entire duration of Tishrei, to make it easier for people to be able to see the Rebbe during the davening. So when the Rebbe would come to his place, they would put down the other shofars, the Sidurim, etc. Then the Rebbe would turn around, the Rebbe would make a 360-degree turn, right? And he would be also looking at the crowd, and it's according to Kabbalah that there's a certain chen, a certain grace, which is on the face of the Baal Tekeah, and therefore it's appropriate that the congregation should look at the face of the Baal Tekeah at that time. So the Rebbe made this 360-degree turn for everybody to be able to see him. But the Rebbe was looking at the crowd too, also because there's a story, it's a different story, not for now, but the Rebbe said to somebody something that what he noticed, how the person looked, whether he was wearing glasses, not glasses, not going to go into the story. The Rebbe made a very quick 360-degree, and the Rebbe was looking, and people were jumping to want to see the Rebbe, etc. And that was the Rebbe's Tekiyos. The rest of the Tekiyos was Rabbi Mendel Tenenbaum, and as was mentioned before, that Rabbi Groner, my uncle, used to signal, because he used to watch where the Rebbe was holding, and he would signal Rabbi Tenenbaum when it's time to blow the Tekiyos in the silent Shemoneh Esrei. Maybe be zoiche to the Tkabe Shofar Godel Lecheroseinu, right? To hear, just to finish off with a word from the Berditchever. The Rebbe said, and our Rebbe said, the Friedrich Rebbe said about the Rebbe Berditchev, he built a palace of Limbud Schus, of advocacy for Am Yisrael in Shemayim. Unbelievable words. And so therefore it's the Schus, it's appropriate to mention Rebbe Yitzchak Berditchev and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, just mentioning his name. So Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev said once to the Eibishter, he said, Rebbeinu Shalom, he said, you tell us in the Torah that we have to blow 9 Tekiyos. How many do we actually blow? 100. That's only just in one shul, and that's only one day, etc. So how many thousands? Maybe could be millions of Tekiyos are blown around the world. Rebbeinu Shalom, from you we are asking only for one Tekiyah. Tekah b'shofar godel lecheroseinu. Sound the great shofar for our freedom. One shofar sound we're asking. So may we be zeicha that it should be immediately now before this Rosh Hashanah, and we'll be in Shalayim with the Beis Hamikdash, and we'll see and we'll hear the Rebbe blowing shofar Om Kein Yiratzon.